Perfect. All right. So everyone at 6:05, you can feel free to take over.
All right, thanks. Well, thanks for having me. My name is John Nieh. I'm one of the partners at the law firm Trowbridge Nieh LLP. That's me and my partner on the screen. My partner is Gene Trowbridge. He's, I think you could tell by the pictures, he's definitely a little bit more experienced than I am. And I think if you've been in this space long enough, syndications and real estate investing, you've probably seen Gene speak, or at least heard of his name, because he's pretty well known in the syndication space. But for me, at least, I'm definitely don't have as much experience as him, but I have been doing this for about 8 years now. I went to UCLA for undergrad and law school. Graduated UCLA law in 2016, about 8 years ago, and been doing representing clients through their syndications ever since. I've invested myself personally in a few deals in the LA area. I used to, live in LA because I went to UCLA. So I, had a small 3-unit property that I did, where I think it's called like house hacking, right? Where you live in one of the units and then you rent out the other units. And then I also did a single family fix and flip in LA. Haven't syndicated any deals myself, but maybe one day I will add that to my resume. I live in the Bay Area now, for those that don't know me. My wife and I, we moved up here in 2020 during COVID, and we live in San Bruno now, which is right next to the airport. It's also really, really windy here, so if you hear like a tarp flapping behind me, that's the reason. But anyways, getting into the presentation that I have for you guys. First thing, have a little disclaimer. You don't have to read the whole thing. Basically, what it says is, even though I'm an attorney, I'm not your attorney. This is all just education purposes. We don't have an attorney-client relationship, so please don't take any of this as legal advice. If you need legal advice, give me a call. We offer free 30-minute consultations. You go to our website, tnllp.com, and you can sign up for a free consultation with either myself or my partner, Gene. So anyways, what is a syndication? Well, this is essentially a diagram of a typical syndication. When you're investing in real estate, more often than not, you are probably using some sort of entity to hold the asset. Majority of the time you're using an LLC, right? So if you were doing a deal on your own, you would probably set up an LLC, and the LLC would own the property. And then, all the cash flow from the property would be paid to the LLC and then paid to you as a member of the LLC. So LLCs, kind of some terminology we have to put out there. LLCs don't have partners, they have members. LLCs don't have shareholders, they're called members. So I know, people kind of use the term GP and LP. Technically that refers to a limited partnership, right? And that's like a specific type of entity. But I know, like, in this industry, in this space, like, when you're talking about a GP, what you're really talking about is the sponsor, the person that's, managing the deal on behalf of everyone else. In the case of an LLC, there actually isn't a GP. It's what you would call the manager of the LLC. But anyway, so if you're doing a property, or if you're doing a deal on your own, right, you would use an LLC to acquire the asset, the underlying property. Well, at some point, right, you would, if a deal comes across your desk where you can't do it yourself, you don't have enough capital on your own, what are your options? Well, syndicating the deal is an option, right? So you're essentially pulling together a bunch of investors into the LLC with you to acquire the deal. And this is what it looks like, right? So you have what we call the investment LLC, which owns the property, or if you're doing multiple properties, then it would own all of the individual properties. And then you have your members that are your investors that own interest in the LLC. They purchase interest in the LLC, and they receive cash distributions from the LLC because of their ownership interest. And then you also set up a manager LLC, which manages the investment LLC. And the manager LLC is the one that the sponsor or the GP controls. And because of that relationship where the manager LLC manages the investment LLC, it receives distributions, it receives a share of cash flow, it receives fees from the investment LLC paid to the manager. The last little box on the bottom, enhancers, right? So depending on the deal, you might need to pull in some sort of, or third parties to enhance the deal, right? So for either lending reasons, say you don't have a good enough credit score, you need what the lender calls a key principal, or KP. You need someone else to come to the deal with you to boost up your credit score, or for liquidity purposes, right? So when you are negotiating with the lender, they need to make sure that the sponsor group, everyone who's part of that GP group, has enough net worth to cover the balance of the loan. If you don't have that on your own, you're probably gonna have to go out and get a key principal or a KP to boost up your net worth for that purpose. And then you also might need help raising money. So you might need to bring more GPs into the group, into the manager LLC for that purpose, is to get more investors into the deal. And then lastly, if you don't have experience managing properties, you might need to hire like a third-party property management company. So this is a syndication, but the key question when it comes to syndicating a deal is, are you selling securities, right? Because once you cross that threshold of selling securities, then now you are in the SEC world, and now there's a whole bunch of rules that you have to follow as far as how to raise money legally, right? So how do you determine if something is a security? Well, luckily we have a pretty simple test for that in our world, which is called the Howey test. It's a 4-factor test, 4-prong test, and all 4 prongs have to be met, which are on the screen. Number 1, there's an investment of money. Number 2, there's a common enterprise, which just means there's a pooling of investor funds together. Number 3, there's an expectation of profit. And then 4, solely from the efforts of a promoter. And if we go back, if you look at this picture again, you see that this definitely is a sale, or involves the sale of a security, right? Because members are contributing their capital, contributing their money into the investment LLC, which is a pooling of investor funds in a common enterprise, right? Investors are doing that because they expect to make a return on their investment, they expect to make a profit. And there is a manager LLC, the promoter, who is doing all the work to realize that profit, right? So if you are syndicating a deal and that is how you're setting up with that structure, then you are selling a security. And if that is true, then there's 2 basic rules that you have to be aware of. Number 1, you are required to provide full disclosure of all material information to your investors. And what that means is, put yourselves in the shoes of a reasonable investor, and what information would you want to know before making a decision to invest? And that's everything that you have to provide to investors. And then number 2, you are supposed to register your securities, register the sale of your securities with the SEC, unless you have some sort of exemption. And that's really, the area of law, or what Gene and I practice, is navigating these exemptions, navigating these rules to make sure that you're syndicating and raising money legally in accordance with the SEC rules. So just wanted to kind of reiterate, investment LLC, that's the pooling of the funds, pooling investor funds. If it's managed by the manager LLC, it is definitely a security, because that's the promoter, right? That's solely through the efforts of the promoter. Well, sometimes we get asked, how do I avoid this, right? How do I set up my deal so that we're not selling a security? Well, if it's manager managed, for sure, you're selling securities, because all four prongs of the Howey test are met, right? There's investment of money, common enterprise, expectation of profits, solely through the efforts of the promoter. The first 3 prongs are pretty much impossible to get around, right? Anytime you're syndicating a deal, there's going to be investment of money involved. There's going to be a pooling of investor funds, because you're raising money from multiple investors. And investors are going into the deal expecting to make a profit. There's no way around those, first three prongs. But the last prong, solely through the efforts of a promoter, in my opinion, that is probably the only way that you could get out of the securities world. And to do that, if you're using an LLC, the only way to do that would be to make sure that there is no more promoter, right? There is no solely through the efforts of a promoter. And what that means is all the investors, everyone in the company has to have a say in how the company is run, has to have decision-making authority, right? And to do that with an LLC, you would need to set it up as member managed, which basically says that every member of the LLC has a say in how the company is run. And that's totally doable, right? Like if you have a deal, if you're syndicating a deal and you only have, 2 or 3 investors, that's possible because you could get decisions, you could make decisions. It wouldn't be too difficult to make decisions with, 3 or 4 people. But once you get into the world of, raising money from maybe 10, 15, 20 people, how are you going to make decisions? How are you going to choose what colors to paint the doors at the property? How are you going to choose which property management companies to go with if you have to get approval from, say 20 investors just to make this one decision? So it's not really feasible in those situations. So if you are, thinking about doing a deal and you need, 10, 15, 20 investors, then you probably need to set up the LLC as manager managed. And if that's the case, then now you are in the SEC world. And the basic rule is, you have to register your securities unless exempt. Well, registration is basically everything covered in the box on the right. So large public offerings, essentially doing an IPO. And you can imagine, the costs involved in doing an IPO. Companies are spending hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in underwriting and legal and accounting. Not really feasible in our world. And then there's other issue of, how long does it take to do an IPO? It could take, months, if not years. And then there's ongoing compliance issues that you have to, take care of once you're a public company. So public offerings aren't very feasible in our space. What about small public offerings under Regulation A or Reg CF? Reg A, I'll just talk kind of briefly about it because it is relevant in our space, but we don't have that many clients that utilize it. But basically the highlights of Reg A, it allows a company to raise up to $75 million per year. You can raise money from accredited investors and non-accredited investors, but non-accredited investors are capped on how much they can invest, which is the 10% rule, which is either 10% of their annual income or 10% of their net worth, whichever is less. But one of the great things about Reg A, and one of the reasons why it's considered like a small public offering, is because it allows advertising. You can solicit investors. You can market your offering to any investor any way you see fit, right? So you could advertise on Facebook. You could send, email blasts. You could, make a TV ad if you really wanted to. One of the drawbacks, though, is you do have to hire an accounting firm to either audit or review your financial statements. So it's additional cost. And then one of the benefits, though, is that you're actually preempted from blue sky filing requirements, which means, so to kind of explain that, blue sky requirements means that you have to go to every state that you're raising money from. So if you have, 50 investors and they're from all 50 states, you have to go to all 50 states and basically find or basically apply to each state to start raising money. Being preempted from that requirement basically means you don't have to do that. You don't have to go to every state to ask for approval before raising money. So that's one of the benefits of doing a Reg A plus. Some of the drawbacks, though, number one, it can be quite expensive compared to other types of offerings. So legal costs, I want to give an estimation, but you're probably going to spend $50,000 to maybe over $100,000 in legal costs to do a Reg A plus. And then there's also the time issue, because if you're doing a Reg A plus, you actually have to get pre-approval from the SEC before you can start raising money. And that approval process takes anywhere from 6 months to a year. So it's not, it's definitely not feasible if you're syndicating a specific property, right? So if you have a property under contract and you need to close in 30 or 60 days, Reg A Plus is definitely not possible. The people that do Reg A Pluses in our space, they're doing some sort of blind pool offering. They're raising money, from investors to acquire a bunch of different, apartment complexes that haven't been identified yet. So that's more really what's more geared towards. Regulation crowdfunding, also considered a very, very small public offering, because number one, just like Reg A and full-blown public offerings, it allows advertising, so you can market your offering to anybody. And number two, you can, take anybody. You could take accredited and non-accredited investors. However, the cap is much smaller for regulation crowdfunding. It's $5 million each year. And then one of the requirements is you can't raise money on your own. You are required to raise money through a registered crowdfunding portal. And, because they're essentially registered broker-dealers, they charge broker-dealer fees. The three I listed here are, in my opinion, the three most popular regulation crowdfunding portals, which are WeFunder, Start Engine, and Republic.co. And in my opinion, because you're required to use one of these portals, it makes sense to get listed on one of the more popular, more well-known portals, because they're going to have a larger investor database. They're going to have far more reach than, say, some of the other portals that aren't as popular. So if you're interested in doing a Reg CF, my first piece of advice would just be to talk to one of these portals and get a sense of their criteria, their application process. But regulation crowdfunding requires filing the Form C, which is, it's another application process with the SEC, so it can be a little time consuming. And there's also ongoing reporting that you have to do if you're doing a regulation crowdfunding offering. So it can be it's more expensive than what people expect, right? Because you think, oh, it's, you're only raising $5 million a year. This must be like a cheap and easy way to raise money. And you would be wrong, because it's actually a little bit expensive because of all the additional paperwork and compliance issues that you have to go through. Regulation crowdfunding is more geared towards, startup companies. It's more analogous to like angel investing, in my opinion. And if you go to those websites, you'll actually see the types of companies that get listed. WeFunder tends to be more like a competitor to Kickstarter, right? So there's like a company that's selling a product. Start Engine has more of like a startup feel to it. So there's like tech companies that get listed. Republic.co, I think, is more broad. But you'll notice like there aren't any real estate offerings at all that are usually utilizing regulation crowdfunding. And I think it's because the time issue, right? It takes some time to do a Reg CF. And also the cost is just a little bit more expensive than what people anticipate. So with that being said, what other options are available? Well, there's only two left, really, that are if you're syndicating a deal, these are your options, basically. And those are rules 506B and 506C under Regulation D. Let me just talk about their similarities first, and then I'll talk about the differences. But both rules allow an unlimited amount of money to be raised. So there's no cap on how much you could raise each year. And both offerings allow you to raise from unlimited number of accredited investors. 506B, though, is more of the traditional type of syndication, because number one, it doesn't allow advertising. So you're raising money from people that you have a pre-existing relationship with. So, if you hear people say, I'm doing a friends and family offering, this is really what they're talking about, is doing a 506B offering. In addition to accredited investors, though, in a 506B, you are allowed up to 35 non-accredited but sophisticated investors. And a sophisticated investor is basically someone based on their education and their investment experience. They possess the knowledge to understand all the inherent risks of this particular deal, right? So the great thing about that is, somebody who might not be accredited and who might not be sophisticated today, you could educate them, you could bring them up to the level of sophisticated investor and have them invest in your future deals, which is great. And I think that's one of the advantages of the 506B versus the other types of offering is it allows up to 35 non-accredited investors. 506B, a PPM is recommended so the rule says if you're only selling to accredited investors, then a PPM is technically not required. A PPM, by the way, is a private placement memorandum. So if you've never seen one or heard of that before, it's basically the big disclosure document that you have to give if you're doing a 506B or a 506C offering. It contains, the terms of the offering, so how much money you're raising, what are you selling? Is it equity or debt? How much equity in the company you're giving? How many classes of investors are in the company? There's the risk section, which is obviously very large. It talks about, the distribution plan or the waterfall plan, all the fees, basically all the required information, all the material information that's required is contained within the PPM. And if you're doing a 506B offering and you sell to even one sophisticated investor that's not accredited, then the rule says a PPM is required. You have to, by rule, give a PPM to all of your investors. However, if you don't have any sophisticated investors and you're only selling to accredited investors, then technically you don't have to provide a PPM. It's just recommended by the rule. But again, the other rule is that you still have to provide all material information to your investors. And the best way to do that is just to give them a PPM, because that's going to contain all that information. And then again, 506B does not allow advertising. So you can't solicit investors you don't know if you're doing a 506B offering. 506C, though, it does allow advertising. So you can market your offering under a 506C offering. However, all of the investors in a 506C offering have to be accredited. So you can't take any sophisticated investors, and you have to take steps to be reasonably assured that everyone is accredited. And what that means is verification. So you have to have some sort of verification process to make sure everyone is accredited. The easiest way to do that is just to hire a third party. So there's a bunch of companies out there that provide those services of verifying investors. In fact, I think one of the most popular ones is verifyinvestor.com. No worries. Yeah, so Verify Investor, you just pay them, I think, 50 or 60 bucks per investor, and they'll go through that process to verify that everyone's accredited. So you don't have to worry about doing that yourself. And because everyone is accredited, then a PPM technically isn't required, but we still recommend you have one because you are required to still provide all the material information to your investors. So those are the four options to kind of give you a sense of, the marketplace. There's a report that's put out every year by the Office of the Office of the Advocate for Small Business Capital Formation. It's a division within the SEC. And their main job is to promote capital formation for small businesses, to enact policy to make it easier for smaller companies to raise money. But anyways, they put out a report every year that summarizes how much money is raised under each type of offering. And for that year, under Regulation D, just by itself, $2.9 trillion was raised. Out of that, 506B had about 2.7 trillion, 506C had 169 billion, and then Regulation A only had 1.5 billion, and Regulation CF only 352 million. And to kind of give you a sense of that, I made a little pie chart, and you can't even see, the tiny little slice that is Reg A and Reg CF. In the grand scheme of things, nobody really uses those two offerings. and this is all industries combined, right? This isn't just real estate. This includes, insurance and banking and agriculture, all the industries combined. Reg A is only 0.05% of the capital being raised, and then Reg CF is 0.01%. The vast majority, 94%, is raised under 506B, and then about 5.9% is under 506C. And in my opinion, the reason for that, the reason why there's such a large discrepancy is time and money, right? So doing a 506B or 506C offering can be very, very fast, can be very quick, because unlike Reg A and Reg CF that have like this approval process with the SEC, if you're doing a 506B or 506C process offering, there is no approval process, right? The only requirement that the SEC has before you start raising money is you file what's known as the Form D, and it's basically a notice filing, just putting the SEC on notice that you're going to be raising money. So they don't approve anything. As soon as you file it, your offering becomes effective and you can start raising money. So in our experience, I mean, you could do an offering within, as long as you have all the entities formed and all the documents drafted, which usually takes, a couple weeks at least, that's as fast as you can do a 506B or 506C offering, which is, a couple weeks, which compared to Reg A and Reg CF, that's a huge benefit. And then the other issue is cost, right? So because, there's less compliance stuff that you have to worry about with Regulation D, legal costs are much, much lower. So to do a Regulation D offering, in our experience is about, definitely under $20,000, right? All in to do a Regulation D offering versus Reg A, which is going to cost, $50,000 to $100,000. And then Reg CF is pretty, it's not as much as a Reg A, but it's probably pretty comparable to doing a Reg D offering. So time and money, in my opinion, those are the two reasons why pretty much everyone either does a 506B or a 506C. So specifically, when we're talking about our clients and syndicators, though, if you're doing your first deal, our recommendation would probably be to do a 506B offering, because number one, you don't have a track record yet. So to go out and raise money from investors that you don't know, right, to solicit investors, that's one of the questions they're going to ask you is, have you done this before? And if you haven't, then they're probably not going to invest in your deal. But who is going to invest in your first deal? Well, it's going to be your friends and family, the people that know you, that are investing in the relationship with you. And if you're going to be doing that, then 506B makes sense because you have a pre-existing relationship with all your friends and family. And they might not be accredited, but your friends and family could be sophisticated investors if you educate them enough, where they can rise to that level. Once you get a few deals under your belt, you build that track record, then you might want to consider doing a 506C offering and marketing your deals to investors, accredited investors that you don't know. And then once you got a few of those under your belt and you're thinking about doing some sort of large blind pool offering, and you want to bring in non-accredited investors, then that's the time to think about doing maybe a Reg A. But you could potentially do it under a 506C as well. It's just you wouldn't be able to bring in any of those smaller non-accredited investors. So one thing I wanted to talk about, and I think I already brought up the first question, is 4 questions that every investor will ask a GP or should ask a GP. So if you're an investor, these are the 4 questions that you should be asking your sponsors. Number 1, have you done this before? And again, if it's their first time doing it, I mean, everyone's going to have to answer no to this question at least once, right? So your first time, you haven't done this before, you haven't syndicated a deal, but maybe you have other experience on your record. Maybe you've done smaller deals on your own without syndicating, without raising money. You just have to have an answer, right? No, but I do have this other experience. And then number two, are you investing yourself? If the deal is so good, are you putting your own capital into it? And you probably should be, right? If the deal is that great, you probably putting your own money into the deal. You might not be putting as much as other investors because you're also contributing, sweat equity, right? You're running the deal, you're doing all the work, but you should, at least have some skin in the game, right? Third question, what happens if something happens to you? So this is all about continuity, having a continuity plan for your offering. And our advice to our clients is to have a partner, right? At least one partner in the deal with you, a co-manager, a co-sponsor. Oftentimes that's a spouse, right? So we have a lot of clients that, it's a husband and wife team that are, working the deal together. And it's at least two people that have ownership interest in the manager entity, and then that's the continuity plan, right? So if something happens to one of the co-GPs, you have another GP there within the management team that can take over. So we definitely don't recommend doing it yourself, because then you're not able to answer that question to investors, because who is going to run the deal if something were to happen to you? And then lastly, the last question that every investor should ask is, what happens if something happens to me? What happens if I need to get my money out of the deal? And that's all about liquidity, right? Which is covered by the operating agreement. So the operating agreement is the governing document for the LLC, for the company. It governs how the company is run. It's the contract, right? The contract between all investors and the manager, and it governs basically everything. So it's very, very important. And the liquidity provision is it's one of the most important provisions within the operating agreement, and it's probably one of the first provisions that you should look at if you're an investor. But in our documents, we have two concepts, right? Voluntary transfer and involuntary transfer. So voluntary is all about, what if an investor wants to get out of the deal? How do they sell their interests? There's typically a process that they have to go through. The manager probably has an approval mechanism, right? They don't want to just allow an investor to sell their interest to anybody, because then you're bringing random people into your company that maybe you don't, you never plan to have these people in your company. So you want that control. But so for our documents, we have, a right of first refusal provision, right? So if an investor wants to get out of the deal and they find a third party that's willing to buy their interests, they have to first go to the company and offer the interest back to the company at the same terms, to allow the manager to control who's in the deal, right? So they have to first offer it back to the company as a whole, and then to every other member, and then also to the manager, right? So everyone has an option to buy the interest from that investor before they could sell to a third party. The other way you could get out is through an involuntary transfer, which is, the investor, something happens to the investor where they're not selling their interest, but their interest passed to someone else. So, the classic example of is an investor dying, what happens to their interest in the company. In our documents, we say that whoever inherits to the investor's interest will inherit only to the economic interest, so only to the rights of, say, cash distributions. They don't get a right to vote in the company. They don't get all those other rights unless the manager approves it, right? So unless the new investor is someone that the manager wants to actually take part in the company, then they could take over all of the investors' interests, not just economic interests. So that's the first provision in the operating agreement. That's, in my opinion, is pretty important that you should look out for. The next provision is there something that allows for removal of the manager, right? So, it depends on whoever's drafting these agreements, right? So we put in our documents that there is a process you're allowed to go through if you're an investor to remove a manager, but you can't just remove them for any reason. We we put specific reasons in our documents. So it's either the manager has committed a crime, or the manager has disappeared, or the manager has, done one of these specific, one of these specific things that we lay out in the agreement. But there needs to be a process, right? There needs to be a mechanism for removing a bad manager. So if you're reading an operating agreement that doesn't have that, I think that would be a little bit of a red flag, that there is no mechanism to replace a bad manager. The next section, the next provision, is pretty relevant right now. There's a lot of syndicators, a lot of GPs that are going through this process right now of doing capital calls. So my opinion of it, I mean, a capital call should be last resort, right? So the manager really should have exhausted all of their other options before they, make this decision. So, they should have already talked to the lender and tried to do some sort of loan modification. They should have tried to get some sort of, a third-party loan, or maybe a loan from specific members or investors in the deal, or maybe loan their own personal funds into the deal. Capital call should be the last resort. If you aren't able to raise the necessary capital to save the deal, well then, what's the last option? You have to ask your investors to put additional funds into the deal. So my thinking is, I mean, there definitely needs to be some sort of mechanism in place to encourage investors to contribute additional capital, right? You can't, I mean, I've seen agreements that basically make it optional, and the only effect on investors who don't contribute is dilution. But if you do that, I mean, you're basically, there's no point in having provision, because no one's going to contribute to the deal, and the deal is going to fall apart and you're going to lose the property. I think there needs to be some penalty. I've seen deals where the penalty is really, really, bad. There could be a provision that basically removes all of the investors' rights to receive future distributions unless they contribute to the capital call. I mean, I wouldn't go that far. And if you read a provision like that in your agreement, that might give you some pause to invest in the deal, because you're essentially giving the manager right to take away your investment for not contributing additional capital. So yeah, that's capital calls. I mean, I know it's a touchy subject, especially right now, especially if you're in a deal right now that is going through this process. Unfortunately, if you're in a deal, you've already signed the agreement, you've already, invested in a deal, and they have this provision in the operating agreement that says the manager can take away some of your rights as an investor. There's very, very little you could do. Unfortunately, you sign the document, you agree to all these terms. So yeah, it's you're really at the discretion of the manager. Hopefully there's if the manager is doing something illegal or something wrong, hopefully there's some sort of provision that allows you to remove the manager without having to spend a lot of money, like going through some sort of lawsuit. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely an issue for a lot of my clients right now. I will say my clients who I think are really good to their investors and want to take care of them, they always are willing to amend their documents, amend their operating agreement to make it softer for their investors, to help their investors out. So that's also an option for any LPs that are on this call. You just ask your GPs, what are they willing to do to kind of to help, right? And then lastly, voting rights. So, I think you'd be kind of surprised, but sometimes some operating agreements don't even give investors any voting rights at all. I've seen agreements like that, but that's definitely a section that you want to pay attention on is, what are you allowed to vote on? What's the required percentage? Do you get approval for major decisions like selling the property, refinancing, or is that all in the manager's discretion? A lot of my clients, they like to reserve that right because they don't believe that investors should have that ability to vote on selling the property. I would say maybe it's about like 50-50. Half my clients, they don't allow their investors to vote on sale, and then half just need to get majority approval. But yeah, the operating agreement again is probably the most important document that you're going to read because it's the governing document. It controls how the company is run, how you get your money back if something goes wrong. It controls everything. So it's definitely the most important document. So let's talk about mistakes that I've seen. Number one, I don't know if I've personally seen anyone draft their own documents, but my partner Gene brings this up, so maybe he has. But definitely don't draft your own documents because, well, number one, if you're an attorney, I guess it's okay. But if you're not an attorney, you would be, I guess, practicing law when you're not an attorney, which is illegal. But this is very highly specialized what we do. So if you want it to be done correctly, and if you want to make sure that you're raising money properly and legally, you need to hire an attorney to draft your documents. This one I actually have seen is not reading and following your documents. So I do have clients that they tell me they read everything, but I know it's a lot of legalese, it's a lot of pages. I understand, it can be quite boring, but you really need to read at least the operating agreement because again, that controls everything. And that controls how you're supposed to run the company too. So if the operating agreement says that you have to get a vote for so-and-so and you don't go through that process, well, now you've just, violated that, and investors have a cause of action against you. So that's very, very important. Making cash distributions from reserves, that is a form of fraud. So you should definitely not do that. Cashing out investors with money from new investors, that's what's known as a Ponzi scheme. You should not do that. And then lastly, paying people to raise money for you. So this is very, very touchy because I know it's pretty common practice in our space to have money raisers and to compensate people for bringing investors into the deal. But the SEC rule says if you are paying transaction-based compensation to anyone for raising money for you, they need to be a licensed broker-dealer. And what that means is if anyone is receiving a commission, so if they're getting paid based on how much money they're raising, and they're not licensed by the SEC to do that, that's a huge no-no. You can't do that. Paying someone a finder's fee is debatable so long as that fee is not contingent on how successful the raise is, right? So if you're just paying them a fee to introduce you to a bunch of investors and it's a flat fee, then that's probably okay. But if it's contingent on, their investors investing with you, then that's definitely not okay. But our general advice is to just avoid all of that, do all the money raising yourself, or form some sort of co-GP relationship with anyone that is raising money for you. So if someone comes to you and says, hey, I have this list of a few hundred investors, I want to bring them into your deal, the only way to do that properly would be to have them be a part of the manager LLC, so that they're a co-GP, and so that rule, you're protected from that rule basically. But that is basically everything I have for you guys today. I think there were some questions that popped in through the chat, so let me just go through this real quick. So Tony asked, do all offerings require PPMs? So no, right? So again, if you're doing a 506B or 506C offering, and you're only selling to accredited investors, then technically you're not required to have a PPM. The only time a PPM is required is if you're doing a 506B offering and you're selling to any sophisticated investors. You're not, so a PPM isn't required for a Reg A or Reg CF offering, but they do have a form that's very similar. They just have a different name for it. And basically every offering that you do, there is a form that basically takes the place of the PPM. So either the offering circular or the prospectus. It's the disclosure document. It's the main document for the offering that has the terms, that has the risk sections, all the conflicts of interest. Anytime you're investing in a security, it's going to come with something that looks like a PPM. Someone claimed this is an exempt private offering and we're only allowed accredited investors to invest in this LLC. So a traditional PPM is not required. So that is technically true if they're doing a 506B or 506C offering. But remember, even though a PPM isn't technically required, they are still required to provide all the material information about the offering. So if they have another document, they might not call it a PPM, but it needs to have all the information you need to make an informed decision. So I know some people like to use like slides or some sort of presentation as part of their offering. And if those slides have everything that a PPM normally would, then they're probably okay. But if it's missing information, then they're probably violating that rule that the SEC has regarding full disclosure. And he asks, are there certain types of deals that are more likely to use 506C? I'm assuming people who have trouble fundraising would use that, or maybe because they have to raise a huge amount of money. So I wouldn't say there's certain types of deals. Definitely GPs that have more experience are utilizing 506C. I think the types of deals that utilize 506C versus 506B are pretty similar. You can do you could do specific multifamily, you could do blind pools, you could do semi-specific offerings. As far as people having trouble fundraising, that is one thing that I've seen recently is someone that's doing a 506B offering, they have trouble raising all the money. One option they have is to start a new 506C offering and advertise to investors they don't know to fill in that extra equity that they need. And that's doable. You can do 506B and then 506C. What you cannot do is 506C and then 506B, because 506C allows advertising and 506B doesn't, right? So if you do an advertisement first and then you do an offering that doesn't allow advertising, you've just violated the rules. So you have to do the one that doesn't allow advertising first, and then you do the one that allows advertising. That's the only way to do it. Yeah, famously practiced by Bernie Madoff. That's right. Looks like that was all the questions in the chat. Does anyone else have any questions for me?
I actually do. Can you go back to the things you should not DIY that slide?
Sure.
What are loopholes too? Because I feel like making cash distributions from reserves. I feel like I've seen some people do that, but like I don't know, because I think in Tony's class, he mentioned that before with someone, but I don't know if it was actually their reserves, but they started paying out immediately as soon as it closed. So is there a way that they can start distributing right away?
So when I say make cash distributions from reserves, what I'm talking about is someone that is pretending like there's cash flow to their investors, lying to their investors, saying, "Oh, we have cash flow," when they're really just returning investors' capital from reserves. But if you're doing something like that, right, like where you close on the property and you make it clear that, oh, we're overcapitalized, we have too much money, we're going to return some of your capital, and you're making it clear like we're returning capital to you guys. This isn't cash flow. That's totally fine. But if you're committing fraud to your investors and saying there's cash flow when there really isn't, that's definitely something that you shouldn't do.
So you're saying like if it's not cash distributions from your original investments, but it could be like it's part of your pref equity, or you're getting a certain distributions per month on interest or something like that.
Yeah, so if the documents say that there's a preferred return, and it's 7% every, or 7% annualized paid every quarter, but the property's not hitting that 7% pref, and the manager wants to pretend like they are, if they want to pretend like the property is, and they pay the investors from the reserves to make it seem like they're hitting that pref, then that's fraud. You're committing fraud at that point, which is a huge no-no.
And then the other question that's also with this slide is the other way of seeing you can't pay people to raise money for you. Then what about all these deals with cap raisers? What is their role in this?
Yeah, so ideally the cap raiser will be part of the manager company, right? So there's something called the issuer exemption. If you're part of the issuer, then you don't need a license to sell securities. You don't need a license to sell your own securities, right? So if they are part of the GP team, if they have ownership interest in the manager LLC, and they have active role in the company, then they're probably fine. If their only role is to be a money raiser, quote unquote, and they kind of disappear after they help raise the funds, that's, I think, something to watch out for. That's a red flag, because they could be investigated by the SEC for basically selling without a license. And not only does that put them at risk, but it puts the whole company, everybody at risk, because the SEC can say, oh, like, he's tainted the entire offering. And one of the mechanisms they have to remedy those situations is what's called a rescission offering, which basically you have to refund all of your investors. Yeah. A couple other questions came in with regard to setting management fees. Are there any legal risk aspects we should consider? So not really legal risk, but I will talk about, I guess, red flags as far as fees. So if a GP is front loading, right, if they're getting a lot of acquisition fees or upfront fees, I think you should look out for that. You definitely want mechanisms in place to encourage the GP to make sure the deal runs well and makes money for everybody. So they should probably get most of the compensation on the back end. Especially if they're less experienced and you see like a huge, 5% acquisition fee up front. I would be kind of hesitant to invest in a deal like that. But if they're very, very experienced, right, they have tons of deals under their belt, and you can see their track record, and they're asking for like a 2% acquisition fee, I think that's more reasonable. They have experience. They're bringing you into this deal that they've sourced and they've done all this work for. I think they deserve some compensation for putting it together for you. Asset management fees, to give you guys like an idea of what our clients are charging, I would say anywhere from 1 to 3% as asset management fee is pretty standard. As far as acquisition fees, I would say 1 to 3% of the purchase price is pretty standard. Yeah. Other fees that we see, so there could be like a refinance fee, like typically 1% of the new loan amount gets paid to the manager for successfully refinancing the property. There might be some sort of disposition fee, percentage of sales proceeds. If there's planned renovation or construction on the property, there might be some sort of construction oversight fee, like a percentage of construction costs. What other fees? Oh, like a loan guarantor fee. If one of the GPs is personally signing on the loan, personally guaranteeing the loan, they might charge a percentage of the loan proceeds as a loan guarantor fee. Those are typically the fees that we see. It's a return of capital, not distribution as a result of operating cash flow. Exactly right. So if you're pretending a distribution is a return on investment when it's really a return of capital, that's committing fraud. What is the SEC raising license called? So it's actually licensed from FINRA. So either a Series 65 or Series 7, or I think the last one is Series 87. One of those licenses, your licensed broker-dealer, licensed securities broker-dealer. Do operating agreements have regulated templates, sort of like CAR does for residential purposes, purchase agreements, or do lawyers draft their own and each operating agreement is wildly different? Yes, so every operating agreement is wildly different based on attorneys drafting it, based on the GPs who are telling the attorneys what provisions they want. There are services out there where you can kind of get like a template, like what is it, Rocket Lawyer, or what's the other one? I forget, but I wouldn't recommend using those because they're very basic. Usually the templates that you get, they're not going to have all the provisions that you need to have a syndication company properly run. But yeah, to answer your question, it's gonna be different deal to deal, based usually on the attorney that's drafting it. If the capital raiser is not part of the manager LLC and create a SPV to invest in a fund, is that legal? The capital raiser also invested their own money in the deal. So Kathy, I'm not exactly sure if that is legal. I think I would need to know more about the SPV and the capital raisers, their ownership, the structure of it, to give my opinion. I would be wary of some sort of relationship like that. It seems like they're just trying to get around that rule if they're setting up a new specific entity just so that they can collect some sort of fee by bringing their investors into the deal. So it might be legal. I just don't know without knowing more information about the specific deal. Thanks, Super Dave. LegalZoom. That's exactly what I was thinking about. Don't use them to draft your syndication documents. Fund of funds. I am not familiar with that fund of funds. I am familiar with the fund of funds model. So if they're receiving compensation through their fund of funds, and that's the only way that they're being compensated, then it's probably okay. It's only an issue if the underlying fund that they're investing in is paying them an additional fee to bring their investors to the deal. Right. So if he sets up his fund of funds and he's raising money on his own to invest in other syndications and other funds, and he's getting fees from his own investors, and that's the only way he's being compensated, then he should be fine. He doesn't need a securities license or a FINRA license to do that. But if he's going to other funds,
Can you explain the fund of funds thing?
Okay, yeah, sure. A fund of funds basically is you're setting up an LLC not for a specific deal. You're setting up a syndication to invest in other people's deals, in other people's syndications, right? So it's a fund to invest in other funds. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah. So if the only compensation he's getting is from his fund of funds, then that's probably okay. But if he's getting compensation for bringing his fund of funds to the underlying fund, then he might get in trouble for doing that, for selling license or selling securities without a license. Any red flags in selling properties you already wholly own to a syndication you're setting up and managing? That is a great question. I mean, I think the biggest red flag is if they're selling it at a huge profit that's not reasonable, and they're basically setting up the syndication so that they could make a ton of money for themselves personally. I think that's a huge red flag. Oftentimes when we have clients that do that, what they'll do is they'll actually sell it to the syndication under market, so for cheaper, right, to as a benefit to their investors, or they'll contribute the property itself to the syndication. So they'll just transfer the title over from themselves personally to the syndication. That's a great question. Cool. It looks like it's about 7:05. Doesn't seem like there's any more questions coming in. I did want to put our contact info back on the screen. Again, we do free consultations. So, if you have a specific question about a specific deal that you're in, or, a deal that you're thinking about doing, you just go to our website, tnllp.com, to sign up with the free 30-minute call with me or my partner, Gene. We're also on YouTube. We put out tons of videos, or my partner, Gene, does. At least he puts out more content than I do, about like all these topics like capital calls, capital accounts, red flags, all that stuff. So you could just find us on YouTube there. But yeah, thanks for having me. I know the debate was going on at the same time, so I think that probably was a little bit more interesting. I'm assuming. I guess I'll go read the highlights later. But yeah, it's a pleasure. Happy to do another one of these for you guys, and hopefully I get to see some of you guys in person.
And also a little bit of quick announcements is that for those who are in here, we're going to have a field trip to Dallas at the beginning of October, from October 6th to the 11th, to learn more about multifamily syndications, and also to attend the Old Capital Conference. And that's actually where I met John, and I dragged him along to join us on this because I also heard he's from the Bay. So yay! There weren't that many Asians in that space, so I'm glad I'm dragging all the Asians along. But for this field trip, we'll be learning about more about multifamily syndications and operations, and also industrial triple net for commercial real estate, just to give you a little bit of different ideas of investments out there other than single family homes. And especially this is great for those who one day want to consider becoming syndicators themselves and doing something big. Well, a couple limitations is that this field trip is not going to be newbie friendly. Most of the people I know in this group, you guys know you guys at least know what's going on, so you'll be cool. And also the other is that this is going to be only for accredited investors. There's no capital raising or anything. This is all edutainment and learning from each other, but we want to keep the level of conversation a little bit higher. So I'm going to throw the link in here just for people if you guys want to read more about what we're doing and what we're learning. And Tony is one of our mentors. He's going to be there and guiding us on the conversations as well. So hopefully I will see you guys in Dallas. But other than that, thank you again, John, for tonight, and I'll see everyone really soon. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.